Hey, I wanted to talk a little bit about my take on egalitarianism. Um, when I was, well, a lot of leftists, a lot of socialists, will basically take egalitarianism as a normative thing. They would justify anything in the name of egalitarianism, and they will say, this is wrong because it's not egalitarian, or this is justified because it is. And um, I can't help but realize that the concept is so muddled and contradictory that I think it's not really an ideology so much as an excuse. I remember in college, I had a class, and we weren't really even discussing egalitarianism. It was about education, because I was in a ed major, and I just remember thinking that the only way you could ever get equality of ends is with inequality of means. So if, say, we say everybody should have, 10,000 square feet of housing, um, and say we were able to actually accomplish that, there would be equality of people who have 10,000 feet of housing, but then people who already had more than that will have lost, people who had less than that will have gained, and there will not have been equality in that sense. And there's no way to get around this. There's always going to be equality in ends is always going to entail an inequality in means. And also there's the whole humans are not equal in any quantifiable way. You might talk about principles or philosophy or something, or metaphysics, but at least in terms of physical properties, scientifically, we're not the same height, we're not the same weight, we don't have the same ratios, we don't have the same mass, we don't have the same blood type, experiences. Even identical twins, and there's research that identical twins are not perfectly identical, but just assuming you had two individuals who were genetically identical, they would have occupied different spaces, they would have had different perspectives on the world. They're not identical. But I think what it is here is similar to the video I made on one vote equals one person equals one vote. It doesn't make any sense, but it justifies something that people want, and so they go for it. And so what's it's justifying here is theft. A lot of socialists want to take things from people. Usually they want to take things from rich people, but not always. And they need an excuse as to why that's okay. And the excuse is that it's egalitarian, or they're aiming for egalitarianism. And I got this in my head today because I just watched Freedom Watch, actually, and he had a Democratic pollster on, and although the pollster didn't say that this was his view, he did say, well, Democrats think that taxing the rich is perfectly fine. And the reason they think taxing the rich is fine is because they want to take the rich's money. They think they want to redistribute that property to themselves. And any philosophy that they can think up that, nominally says that that's okay, then they endorse. Even if the philosophy or the idea doesn't really make any sense. As is the case with egalitarianism. It doesn't really make any sense. The normative case for it, I've never heard it made. Why is it necessary that people be equal? Who determines what equality actually is? Do we go around chopping the legs off people? Do we make all the cocks the same length? I mean, because even if we all have the same income, there's still going to be jealousy and stuff. People are going to look and say, hey, that guy's better looking, or not as good looking, or he's better with women, or she gets more, cat calls or whatever. And if egalitarianism is a normative thing, then it makes sense to redress all these grievances. And of course, I'm not a big literary person, but there have been a number of authors who have written novels about egalitarian societies, and to my knowledge, they're all dystopian. I don't think anybody's written the glorious novel of where everyone is actually the same. And in many of the dystopians, the government usually, or whatever the organization that runs everything, tends to portray itself in the society as great, but this is a propagandistic lie and a justification for evil. And this is as true in reality as it is in these dystopian works of fiction. It is an excuse to steal. The thing is, it doesn't even achieve the ends entailed, at least as it's usually applied, because 99% of the time, I mean, there's a few egalitarians who do not believe that the state should be used, but the vast majority do. But even those who don't, they tend to support egalitarianism when the state does it. So anarcho-syndicalists, they support the state enforcing egalitarianism. And all other egalitarians, they endorse the state anyway. And the thing is when you have a state that's handling the redistribution, the very fact that there is a special class that's job is to do this means that you don't have an egalitarian society. It means that you have a society that one class has, at the very least, political power over everybody else. And of course, this usually translates into whatever degree of material opulence that class desires, which may not be that much. I mean, to my knowledge, the Nazis didn't typically live it up too much. Now, I guess you could say Goering did and Hitler did, but they still. That doesn't mean that they couldn't have lived up as much as they wanted, because they were the redistributors of wealth. I guess I shouldn't have used them because they're the cliched example. I'm sorry. Just that same example will apply basically to any government. And furthermore, as a matter of historical record and empirical fact, attempts to use the government to redistribute wealth never create a more egalitarian society. The less government you have, and the more free market capitalism you have, that tends to, it doesn't create egalitarianism, but it does actually prohibit the greatest concentrations of wealth. The greatest concentrations, when you have the ideology of a double standard where one class, usually the state, has more moral authority, legislative power, executive power, a lot of people say a monopoly on violence, that's going to cause concentrations of wealth, and not necessarily in the government. The government right now, because of its regulatory powers, has caused great concentrations of wealth in certain industries that are not per se part of the government. But were the government not there, these concentrations would be much harder to accumulate, and they'd be impossible to maintain. So yeah, John D. Rockefeller might be a mega genius and might accumulate a huge fortune. However, without the government, his heirs would inevitably end up spending that fortune away. The only way that it can be codified into something that extends over a century now is if the government basically uses regulatory capture to guarantee this. And interestingly enough, the regulations that do this are hailed by the proponents of egalitarianism as creating and or fostering a more equal society. And of course, this is just not the case. It's interesting the degree to which egalitarians are blind to this. I think part of this has to do with a loose belief in Marx's class analysis, which of course is extremely faulty. Class analysis in general is extremely tricky. I'm not prepared to say it's always wrong, because I think that there are some classes that are tautologically true. For instance, I could say, well, there's the class of people who are 6 feet tall and under, and the class of people that are just over 6 feet tall. I don't think you could argue that those aren't two classes, but the Marxist one is clearly faulty. And I think where this comes up is that you have really rich, powerful billionaires who advocate basically state socialism, who fund all the universities and the think tanks that purport egalitarianism, who provide the political backing to make it happen. Thinking now of the progressive era and the types of Bernard Baruch and John D. Rockefeller and Carnegie. There's quite a few Mellon. This group, and if you look at today, we've got the George Soroses and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's, maybe even the Kochs, depending on who you ask. And a lot of egalitarians see these people and they see them as being wealthy, and so they assume that they couldn't possibly be supporting wealth redistribution, or at least as they conceive it, and so they assume that they aren't, and that despite the fact that they're actually passing the legislation that they favor, they just imagine that they're actually against it. It's all a big ploy. I don't know. Most of them, by and large, never have really looked at it, I have to say. And it just makes them feel good to imagine that the government enacting these redistributive policies, they value the ends those purport to achieve. And the fact that they don't achieve them is irrelevant, and the fact that they're not even the basis for even advocating them in the first place is pretty weak. This is irrelevant. It makes them feel good, and I think it makes them feel good because they think that they can get something from it. And it's true that, some of them will. Some people will benefit from this, but on net they will not, and they will be, and they have created an additional moral weapon to a system that is oppressing them, quite literally, and everybody else. So I really despise people like this, because I see it as, even if they don't target me, I'm poor, I don't make a lot of money, they don't argue in the streets that people like me should pay more taxes. But since they advocate the principle, then they are lending credence to whatever the state does want to do to me, or to anyone else, or to my employers, or whatever. And I find this extremely offensive and enormously destructive to society. And I think also I have an extremely low opinion of these people, because they're out there protesting and actively working towards something that they haven't even thought about. The problems with egalitarianism are fairly obvious, and I've never heard any of them, even indicate that it's even occurred to them, let alone that they found answers to these questions. So here again, classic, sounds good, let's just run with it, even if it's suicidal. And I don't know, we'd be better off with people like that. Well, I'm not going to finish that sentence.